What if the color of your skin determined how you were treated even if you were just a child? Imagine a 12-year-old black boy simply trying to get his basketball from a neighbor's yard, but instead of kindness, he's met with police sirens, harsh accusations, and a community that sees him as a threat. It's a story that starts with a simple misunderstanding, but it spirals into a shocking truth about bias assumptions and the cost of judging someone based on nothing but fear. And the twist: his mother isn't just any parent, she's the most powerful woman in the state, and she's about to turn the world upside down. This is a story that will make you question everything. Stay with us, because you won't believe what happens next. Tell us where you're watching from, and share your thoughts on this powerful true story. Your voice matters. A white woman, standing in her window, gripped her phone tightly and dialed the police. "There's a black kid causing trouble in my yard," she snapped. Her voice was sharp, filled with an assumption of guilt that sent chills down anyone who would hear it. She didn't know his name, she didn't know his story, but to her, that was enough. He was a 12-year-old boy, Ethan Carter, just trying to get his basketball back. The call she made triggered an alarm. Flashing police lights lit up the street, their sirens cutting through the calm afternoon, creating a wave of tension that gripped the air. Ethan, a bright, polite boy who had just moved into the neighborhood with his mom, couldn't understand what was happening. His hands trembled, his chest tight, as he stood next to a police car, confused and scared. All he had been doing was practicing basketball in his driveway. The ball had bounced out onto the street and rolled across the yard of a neighbor, Corinne Thompson. Ethan had no reason to think anything was wrong, he just walked over to pick it up. But what Ethan didn't know was that someone was watching. Through her window, Corinne saw him, and to her, he wasn't a kid playing basketball. No, to her, he was a threat. She didn't even bother to ask if he was okay, if he needed help, or even if he belonged there. No, she instantly assumed he was trouble. So, she called the police. As Ethan walked into her yard to retrieve his ball, he was oblivious to the storm that was coming. Corinne, filled with her own assumptions, had already painted him as a criminal, just a black kid in her mind, someone who didn't belong. By the time Ethan had picked up the ball and started to walk back, police officers had arrived. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car, their faces stern and serious. "What are you doing here, son?" one of them asked. Ethan's voice was shaky as he explained that he was just getting his ball. He had no idea why they were even there, but then Corinne came outside, her voice louder now. "That's him. He's been snooping around here all day. I don't care what he says, he doesn't belong in this neighborhood." The officers exchanged looks, clearly uncomfortable, but still listening to her every word. They were caught in a bind. Corinne's accusations were ringing in their ears. One officer turned back to Ethan, who stood there, frozen, his heart pounded in his chest. He was just a boy, yet he was being treated like a criminal. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, "I wasn't trespassing. I was just getting my ball, it rolled into her yard." But Corinne wouldn't back down. "Sure," she sneered. "That's what they always say. It starts with a ball and before you know it, they're stealing things." Her words stung, each one more hurtful than the last. Ethan felt the weight of her judgment, and as the officer pressed him further, he grew more nervous. "Why didn't you stay in your own yard?" one officer asked him. Ethan's heart sank. He was just a kid, no different from any other, trying to enjoy his day. But now, under the harsh eyes of the officers and the judgmental gaze of Corinne, he felt like an outsider, a suspect. The officers, unsure of how to handle the situation, but swayed by Corinne's insistence, made a decision. "Son, you need to come with us for questioning," one officer said. Ethan didn't argue. He was scared, confused, and didn't want to make things worse. His voice trembled as he asked for one thing. "Can I call my mom?" Corinne, still oblivious to the gravity of her actions, had no idea that the boy she'd just accused of being a criminal was the son of Governor Lisa Carter, the most powerful woman in the state. Ethan's trembling voice reached his mother, and within moments, the wheels of change were set in motion. Lisa Carter didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone and called for help. Within minutes, a convoy of black SUVs arrived, the sound of sirens deafening as they stormed down the street, causing heads to turn in confusion. Karen, still unaware of the storm she had unleashed, looked around in confusion. What could all these vehicles possibly mean? She had called the police for a simple case of trespassing at least. That's what she thought. The convoy rolled to a stop, and out stepped Governor Lisa Carter. The air shifted, the ground seemed to shake under the weight of the moment. When Lisa approached, her calm but powerful presence was unmistakable. She walked straight up to the officers and asked, "What's going on here?" The officers, clearly uncomfortable now, explained the situation: how Ethan had been reported for suspicious activity by Karen. They stumbled through their words, avoiding eye contact. Lisa turned her gaze to Karen, her expression cold but composed. "You called the police on a 12-year-old child?" she asked, her voice sharp. Karen, taken aback, stammered. "I didn't know who he was," she said, her voice faltering. "He was in my yard and I thought he was up to something, but Lisa wasn't having it." "And what exactly does that mean, kids like him?" she asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of its implications. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Lisa's words hit hard, and Karen was visibly shaken, her face falling as the reality of her own actions sank in. She had assumed the worst of a child based solely on his skin color. Lisa turned back to the officers. "What evidence do you have that this boy was doing anything wrong?" she asked them. The officers shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Lisa wasn't done. She stepped closer to Karen, her voice now colder. "Let me be clear. You called the police on a child without evidence, and now you're standing here justifying it. You should be ashamed." The words pierced through the tension, leaving Karen exposed. The crowd, who had been silently watching, now understood the gravity of what had happened. This wasn't just about Ethan, it was about every child who had been made to feel unsafe, unwelcome, simply because of the color of their skin. Lisa, speaking not just as a governor, but as a mother, turned to the crowd. "This isn't just about my son. This is about every child who has been judged unfairly. Every parent who has to worry if their child will come home safely." Her voice was strong, but there was a clear sadness in it as well. "We all have a responsibility. We need to be better." Karen's apology felt empty, but Lisa wasn't finished. She proposed a series of community workshops to address bias and prejudice, to make sure something like this never happened again. Ethan, encouraged by his mother, spoke at a school assembly, sharing how he didn't understand why someone would assume the worst about him just because of his skin color. But now he knew, people need to stand up to assumptions, they need to be better. The incident had started with a simple basketball, but it had become a powerful moment for the entire community. It had exposed biases and forced people to confront the ugliness of prejudice. And while Karen's life would never be the same after that day, the truth was undeniable. Assumptions like hers could ruin lives. But through courage, change and awareness, the community could start to heal. This wasn't just a story about a boy and his basketball. It was a story about the power of truth, the importance of seeing each other as human beings first, and the responsibility we all have to make the world a better, more just place. Imagine standing in a crowd, feeling the weight of every eye on you. Your chest tightens, your hands tremble, and your throat closes up. You're not sure what's happening, but you know one thing for sure: you're not being seen for who you are. You're being judged based on something you have no control over, something as simple and yet as powerful as the color of your skin. That was the reality Ethan Carter, a 12-year-old boy, faced that day. All he had done was chase after his basketball, which had rolled into a neighbor's yard. He had no idea that a simple act would set into motion a chain of events that would expose the darkness of prejudice, the harm of assumptions, and the devastating weight of being judged based on appearance alone. But it wasn't just the police arriving that left Ethan trembling. It wasn't just the accusation of suspicious activity thrown at him by a neighbor, Corinne Thompson. No, it was the deep, cutting realization that Corinne and, in turn, the police had already decided who he was before even giving him a chance. Before they asked him what was going on, before they heard his explanation, they already believed he was guilty. Why? Because he was a young black boy in the wrong yard. And that alone, in Corinne's eyes, was enough to label him as a criminal. This wasn't about Ethan's actions. This was about how he was perceived. In the blink of an eye, he went from being a playful kid enjoying a game of basketball to being viewed as a potential threat, and Corinne didn't hesitate. She didn't ask if he was lost, or if he needed help, or even if he was just a kid doing something innocent. No, her first instinct was to pick up the phone and call the police. "There's a black kid causing trouble in my yard," she said, her voice steady but filled with judgment. And with that, she had already sentenced him without a fair trial, without so much as a question. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Ethan wasn't alone in being treated this way. He wasn't the only one who had been subjected to this kind of prejudice. In that moment, Ethan became a symbol of every child who had ever been seen as suspicious simply because of the color of their skin. He was just a boy who loved basketball, a boy who was trying to retrieve his ball. But to Corinne, he was something else. He was a criminal in the making, and it wasn't just Corinne who saw him this way. The officers, though they tried to be professional, couldn't help but feel the weight of her accusations. They saw the situation through her eyes. And when they asked Ethan why he was there, they didn't ask him in the way you might ask any child. They didn't ask with kindness or understanding, no, they asked with suspicion. "What are you doing here, son?" One of them demanded, as if Ethan had something to hide, as if, somehow, his presence alone was enough to be questioned. And then there was Corinne, standing by the window, pointing at Ethan like he was a criminal, like he was guilty of something he hadn't done. "That's him," she shouted. "He's been snooping around here all day. I don't care what he says. That boy doesn't belong in this neighborhood." Can you feel the weight of that moment? Can you hear the crushing blow of being accused of something you haven't done, based purely on the color of your skin? Ethan stood there, the whispers of the crowd surrounding him, the gaze of the officers upon him, and Corinne's accusations ringing in his ears. He wasn't just fighting for his innocence. He was fighting to be seen for who he really was. "I wasn't trespassing," Ethan stammered. "I was just getting my ball, it rolled into her yard." But those words meant nothing, because Corinne had already decided that he was guilty. To her, his explanation didn't matter, she didn't care. He was a black kid, and that was all she needed to know. And when the officer asked him why he didn't stay in his own yard, Ethan's heart sank. Why was this happening? Why was he being made to feel like a criminal for something so innocent? He was just a child, he didn't belong in a cage of assumptions. The tension in the air was suffocating, and when the officer told Ethan he would need to come with them for questioning, Ethan didn't resist. He didn't argue, he didn't scream out in defiance. He just stood there trembling, his heart racing in his chest. Because what could he do? What was he supposed to do? A simple, innocent act of chasing after a basketball had now spiraled into something far bigger. "I just want to call my mom," Ethan said, his voice shaking. And in that moment, something powerful shifted. Because Ethan's mother, Governor Lisa Carter, wasn't just any mother. She was a powerful woman, a woman who would not let her son be treated this way. The truth was about to come to light, and the weight of Corinne's assumptions was about to be exposed for the world to see. Lisa didn't hesitate. She didn't wait. She made the calls that would change everything. And within minutes, a convoy of black SUVs came tearing down the street, their sirens screaming through the quiet neighborhood. The sound of the engines grew louder, and the neighbors couldn't help but turn their heads, unsure of what was happening. But Corinne, still standing in her yard, had no idea what was coming her way. She thought she was dealing with a simple case of trespassing, but she had no idea she had just accused the son of the most powerful woman in the state. As the convoy rolled to a stop, Lisa Carter stepped out. Her presence was undeniable, her power was palpable. And as she approached the scene, the air seemed to change. The crowd that had been silently watching now turned their attention to her. She didn't rush, she didn't panic. She simply stood tall, her gaze sweeping across the officers, the neighbors, and finally, to Corinne, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the tension like a knife. "What's going on here?" Lisa asked, her voice calm but filled with authority. The officers, suddenly uncomfortable, explained that Ethan had been accused of suspicious activity. But when Lisa turned to Corinne and asked, "You made this report?" Corinne's face flushed with realization. She stammered, trying to explain herself, but the damage had already been done. She had made an assumption based on nothing but fear and prejudice. And then, Lisa Carter delivered a line that would change everything. She turned to Corinne and said, "You called the police on a 12-year-old child. Without evidence, what exactly does that mean? Kids like him?" The weight of those words hung in the air, and for the first time, Corinne saw the gravity of her actions. She had made an assumption. She had decided that Ethan wasn't safe. She had decided that he didn't belong, and in doing so, she had condemned him for no reason other than the color of his skin. Lisa didn't stop there. She demanded an apology, not just for Ethan, but for every child who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. She spoke of fear, of prejudice, and of the need for change. And she challenged the crowd to recognize the harm of assumptions, to understand the power of seeing others as human beings first. But even after all of that, the real weight of this story wasn't about what Corinne had done or what Lisa had said. It was about what this moment represented. This wasn't just about one child being judged. It was about a society that needs to wake up. A society that needs to understand that every child deserves to be seen and treated with respect, regardless of their skin color. Ethan wasn't just a victim in this story. He became a symbol for every child who has been misunderstood, every child who has been judged without cause, and every parent who has had to fear for their child's safety because of their skin. And when Lisa Carter spoke to the crowd, she wasn't just speaking to Corinne. She was speaking to all of us. "We all have a responsibility," she said. "We all have a responsibility to make sure no child is ever made to feel the way my son just did." In the end, Corinne Thompson learned a hard lesson about the weight of her assumptions, and the community was forced to confront the ugly truths that lay beneath the surface. The change had begun, and it was clear that things would never be the same. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly realized the truth, but it felt like a punch to the gut? The kind of truth that shakes you to your core. The kind of truth that forces you to see the world differently, to challenge everything you thought you knew about yourself, about others, about society. That moment is exactly what Karen Thompson was about to face. And it was a moment that would change not only her life, but the entire community she thought she knew. It all began with an accusation. A simple, unfounded accusation. Ethan Carter, a 12-year-old black boy, had done nothing more than chase after his basketball, which had rolled into Karen's yard. A harmless, innocent act, but Karen didn't see it that way. No, to her Ethan was an intruder, a threat, a potential criminal in the making, and without hesitation, without a shred of evidence, she called the police. In that moment, Karen made a decision. She decided that Ethan, because of the color of his skin, was a threat. She didn't know him, she didn't ask who he was or why he was there. She didn't give him a chance to explain. Instead, she acted on assumptions, on fear, on prejudice. And in doing so, she set into motion a series of events that would shake her and the community down to its very foundation. But what Karen didn't know was that the truth was about to be revealed in a way she never could have imagined. What she didn't know was that the child she had accused of causing trouble was no ordinary child. Ethan wasn't just any boy in the neighborhood. He was the son of Governor Lisa Carter, the most powerful woman in the state. And with that truth came a wave of consequences Karen had never seen coming. The sirens that had echoed through the quiet neighborhood that afternoon had been nothing compared to what followed. Within minutes, a convoy of black SUVs came barreling down the street, their lights flashing and engines roaring. The sound was deafening. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle of a young boy being questioned by the police couldn't believe their eyes. Who were these vehicles for? Who were they here to see? And then the door swung open. Out stepped Governor Lisa Carter, tall, poised, and unshaken. The air seemed to change as her presence filled the street. Every person in the crowd could feel the power, the authority, the undeniable weight of someone who was no stranger to fighting for what was right. And as she made her way to the scene, the officers, who had been so sure of their actions, began to hesitate. They had been called to this neighborhood under false pretenses, and now, standing before them, was the one person whose name they all knew, the woman who could, and would, hold them accountable for what had just unfolded. Karen stood there, frozen, her face pale as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had never expected this. She had never thought that the boy she had called the police on would turn out to be the son of someone so powerful, someone who had the ability to change everything in an instant. But that was exactly what was about to happen. As Governor Carter approached, her eyes swept over the scene, over the officers, over the neighbors, over Karen, and then they landed on Ethan, her son. The boy she had raised to be kind, to be respectful, to be innocent. And in that moment, Lisa's gaze softened, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that would soon burn through every ounce of injustice in the air. "What's going on here?" Lisa asked calmly, her voice carrying an edge that demanded answers. A harmless, innocent act, but Karen didn't see it that way. No, to her Ethan was an intruder, a threat, a potential criminal in the making, and without hesitation, without a shred of evidence, she called the police. In that moment, Karen made a decision. She decided that Ethan, because of the color of his skin, was a threat. She didn't know him, she didn't ask who he was or why he was there. She didn't give him a chance to explain. Instead, she acted on assumptions, on fear, on prejudice. And in doing so, she set into motion a series of events that would shake her and the community down to its very foundation. But what Karen didn't know was that the truth was about to be revealed in a way she never could have imagined. What she didn't know was that the child she had accused of causing trouble was no ordinary child. Ethan wasn't just any boy in the neighborhood. He was the son of Governor Lisa Carter, the most powerful woman in the state. And with that truth came a wave of consequences Karen had never seen coming. The sirens that had echoed through the quiet neighborhood that afternoon had been nothing compared to what followed. Within minutes, a convoy of black SUVs came barreling down the street, their lights flashing and engines roaring. The sound was deafening. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle of a young boy being questioned by the police couldn't believe their eyes. Who were these vehicles for? Who were they here to see? And then the door swung open. Out stepped Governor Lisa Carter, tall, poised, and unshaken. The air seemed to change as her presence filled the street. Every person in the crowd could feel the power, the authority, the undeniable weight of someone who was no stranger to fighting for what was right. And as she made her way to the scene, the officers, who had been so sure of their actions, began to hesitate. They had been called to this neighborhood under false pretenses, and now, standing before them, was the one person whose name they all knew, the woman who could, and would, hold them accountable for what had just unfolded. Corinne stood there, frozen, her face pale as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had never expected this. She had never thought that the boy she had called the police on would turn out to be the son of someone so powerful, someone who had the ability to change everything in an instant. But that was exactly what was about to happen. As Governor Carter approached, her eyes swept over the scene, over the officers, over the neighbors, over Corinne, and then they landed on Ethan, her son. The boy she had raised to be kind, to be respectful, to be innocent. And in that moment, Lisa's gaze softened, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that would soon burn through every ounce of injustice in the weight of Lisa's words. What's going on here? Lisa asked. The truth had been revealed, her voice carrying, and the shame of Corinne's actions had been laid bare. But that wasn't the end of the story. No, it was just the beginning. Because what Corinne didn't know was that this moment wasn't just a lesson for her. It wasn't just a lesson for the officers who had failed to question the situation. This was a lesson for everyone in that community and for everyone watching. The lesson was simple but powerful. We are all responsible for the world we create, for the assumptions we make, and for the way we treat one another. Ethan, the innocent child who had been accused of nothing more than retrieving a basketball, had become the symbol of change. He had been through something no child should ever have to face. But now, he was using his voice to speak out. With his mother's encouragement, Ethan stood before his school and shared his story. I didn't understand why someone would think I was bad just because of the way I look, he said. But now I know that we have to stand up to that. We have to be better. And just like that, Ethan's experience had become a catalyst for change. The incident that started with a simple, innocent act of retrieving a basketball had now become a movement to confront bias, to challenge assumptions, and to create a world where every child, regardless of their skin color, can feel safe and valued. Corinne Thompson, once so confident in her place in the community, found herself isolated. Her shame lingered in every glance, in every conversation. She had learned a painful lesson, a lesson she would never forget. But the truth, as painful as it was, had a power all its own. And with that truth came change. The neighborhood would never be the same. Because in the end, the power of truth, of accountability, and of change was undeniable.